Okay, so today I'm doing shadowing of a video about Ho Chi Minh, the Price of Freedom, historical documentary. Because today I want to learn more about our great president Ho Chi Minh. So let's start. In the summer of 1966, the United States found itself in a war it couldn't win against an enemy it didn't understand. Why must young Americans toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place? The answer, like the war itself, is not an easy one. This is a different kind of war, and there are great stakes in the balance. For the Americans, it was a war against communism, but for the Vietnamese, it was a war to break free from the centuries of foreign oppression. At this pivotal moment, let's have a look at the meaning of the pivotal. But for the Vietnamese, it was a war to break free from centuries of foreign oppression. Vietnamese centuries of foreign oppression. At this pivotal moment in their history, they were led by one man who could stop at nothing to free his people. They called him Uncle Ho. To the rest of the world, he was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh believed in the aphorism that is credited to him. Aphorism. Let's have a look at the word aphorism. There's nothing precious than independence and freedom. He loved the challenge, fighting to achieve his goal. But there are thousands and thousands of Vietnamese, and perhaps Americans and French, who don't like him and perhaps detest him. Because Ho Chi Minh obviously was responsible for a very bitter struggle that lasted 25 to 30 years. Millions of Vietnamese would pay the price for Ho Chi Minh's vision of a free Vietnam. A vision that was bold and it was unbreakable. France, 1919. After 4 crippling years of World War, leaders from victorious countries gathered France, 1919. After 4 crippling years of World War, let's see crippling years. Crippling years, leaders from victorious countries gathered at a peace conference at Versailles to discuss the future of the world they had helped tear apart. As the meeting got underway, a shadowy man in a borrowed suit waited in the wings, hoping to be heard. If they were going to discuss a new world order, he had to approach it for the leader's agenda, liberation for his homeland, Vietnam. He tries to meet with various people who are vastly above his station. In the very boldness, the self-confidence of this very young man is really extraordinary. Ho Chi Minh, born Nguyễn Xuân Khương, had fled Vietnam in 1911, vowing to return one day to liberate this country from the French, who had colonized Vietnam in the mid-90s. And was when a peace conference came to town, and although he had no invitation, who dared to believe he would be let in. Vowing to return one day to liberate his country from the French, who had colonized Vietnam in the 19th century. Ho arrived in Paris and were eking out a living. Let's see, eking out a living, what does it mean? Eking out a living, I might understand it in Vietnamese, but let's learn a new phrase, eking out a living, in a series of menial jobs. When the peace conference came to town, and although he had no invitation, who dared to believe he'd be let in? Try to imagine this little guy Theodore, and he really weighed about 85 pounds weight, and he gets dressed up in tails and top hat and a white tie, and he goes out to Versailles. He in effect read an appeal in which he said, "You must agree to dismantle the colonial territories and grant independence to such as the peoples of Indonesia and China." Well, what he got for his effort was a kick in the backside, and nobody paid any attention to him. France had no intention of giving his valuable colony. Howe's plea was ignored. But having anointed himself the voice of Vietnamese freedom, Ho refused to back down. Anoint. Let's see, what is the anoint? After being snubbed at Versailles, he turned his sights eastward, where a Russian revolution was also preaching colonialism. And in 1900, Lenin came out with a famous strategical plan in which he said, communists, in order to bring about the creation of communist society all around the world, first of all had to destroy capitalism. And in order to destroy capitalism, they had to destroy colonialism. Ho called the colonialist communist philosophy the radiant sun. The radiant sun, what's the radiant sun? That would illuminate his country's path to victory. Victory. In 1920, funded his effort for the next several years as he traveled the world, calling for an end to French colonialism. We had not only been oppressed and exploited shamelessly, but we were tortured pitilessly. We have neither freedom of press nor freedom of speech. We are forced to live in utter ignorance and obscurity because we have no right to study. Such is a treatment inflicted in more than 220 million Vietnamese. He became very well known throughout the Vietnamese community and in fact throughout the foreign affairs community. Because this message was not only delivered, it was printed in some newspaper. How drew praise from radical Frenchmen who clung to his word as the country's lone hope for liberation. But his message also infuriated the French, who launched a global manhunt to stop Ho from undermining their colonial regime. Ho dodged his pursuers with a handful of disguises and pseudonym. What is a pseudonym? Undermining the colonial regime. Ho dodged his pursuers with a disguised pseudonym. It's already 10 minutes, right? Pseudonyms. Okay. Including one of the things that is absolutely critical to the success of Ho Chi Minh is that he keeps himself secret. He after all has 6 to 10 names, 6 to 10 different birthdays. He's elusive. But in 1931, Ho's lab ran out. Authorities tracked him down in China, and during a crackdown on political dissident, Ho was taught in Hong Kong dissident. Let's see dissident. Soon after, rumors spread. Authorities tracked him down in China, and during a crackdown on political dissidents, tracked down in Ho was tossed in a Hong Kong jail. Soon after, rumors spread that he had died in prison, and Ho used the confusion to his advantage. When he was eventually released, he slipped away, lowered his profile, and waited for the right moment to re-emerge. I had so much respect for Uncle Ho. In 1941, the world was once again at war. France had fallen to the Nazis, and the Vietnam colony was in the hands of Germany's ally, Japan. Ho Chi Minh, now 50 years old and hiding a far corner of China, saw France's defeat as the chance that he had been waiting for. In February of 1941, disguised as a journalist, Ho hid across the vast Chinese countryside and into Vietnam, presenting himself for the first time with a name that would become legend. He takes his name, Ho Chi Minh, which means he who enlightens, and this is going to be his nom de guerre. After 30 years in exile from his country, in exile, let's see, exile. Immigration. Ho found his reputation had preceded him. Many Vietnamese were ripe for change and had pinned their hopes on the rebel. Ripe for change. Oh my God, I like this. Ripe for change. And then they are pinned their hope. Who had tirelessly led their case. Ho set up camp in a remote area of caves called Pak Bo and began quietly preparing for revolution. First, he would aid the Japanese, then keep the French from coming back. Ho recruited a broad base among those who knew would be critical to his movement's success. Peasant. And the peasants in Vietnam was composed of 90% of the population. If you want to make any referendum, you'd have to rely on the peasant. Ho Chi Minh was very simple, and he got right to the hearts of most people. People really knew Ho Chi Minh was genuine, and it was very important. He had this kind of personality that he was very folksy, and people in Vietnam kind of like that simple folksy boy, and it was an accident that he called him Uncle Ho, because in Vietnam that means you are part of the family. Within a year, Uncle had thousands of supporters ready to fight for the national leaders' cause. He called his group of rebels the Viet Minh, or League for Independence of Vietnam. League for the Independence of Vietnam. League for the Independence of Vietnam. Folksy, what makes sense? Nice, a folksy. He has the folksy way of speaking that puts people at heart at ease. They trained in guerrilla tactics grounded for weapons. Let me learn this program. Rebels, the Viet Minh, or League for Independence of Vietnam. For the next 4 years, they trained in guerrilla tactics, ground for weapons. Ground and fan the flames of resistance throughout the Vietnamese countryside. But Ho and his army weren't the only ones hoping to defeat the Japanese. In 1945, intelligence agents from the United States Office of Strategic Services landed in Vietnam to help Ho fight their common foe. The OSS boasted a whole supply of food and sling artillery with battle weapons and ammunition, and they trained Viet Minh in modern warfare. With his addiction to American cigarettes and near fluent English, Ho quickly befriended his new partners. Ho Chi Minh was all kind of guy. He could tell jokes, he could smile, he was a patrician, he was a father figure. He was a man of obvious brilliance to the Americans who he dealt with. Backed by the OSS, in August of 1945, the Viet Minh drove Japanese occupation forces out of Vietnam. On September 2nd, surrender. Okay, so this one, I want to take a picture of this one. Out of Vietnam. On September 2nd, Japan surrendered and the war ended with an Allied victory. That same day, the streets of Hanoi surged with hopes of independence, and Ho Chi Minh believed the time that had finally come to step in and claim his country. new national government. 2nd of September, Ho Chi Minh, dressed in a very simple khaki suit with the little flip-flops, issued the famous speech that would declare independence of Vietnam from colonial control. Flip-flops issued that famous speech, which he declared the independence of Vietnam from colonial control. This immortal statement appeared in the Declaration of the United States in 1777. All men are created equal. He quotes from the American Declaration of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, coming out of his mouth. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was a very clever public relations gambit on his part. He knew that the United States would be a big factor, a major player, and in Ho Chi Minh's struggle, and he felt that he could appeal to Western idealism. As the Star-Spangled Banners played in the background, Ho interrupted himself to ask the crowd if they understood him. In response, nearly 1 million of his countrymen exploded in applause. I got caught up. Goosebumps. When that declaration takes place, Ho Chi Minh goes from an obscure figure to a person with perhaps 100% name recognition across all of Vietnam, and he's suddenly transformed into the symbol of Vietnamese nationalism. Ho has stepped in the power vacuum led by the defeated Japanese, but within just a few months, the world's political climate shifted dramatically. The biggest threat to democracy suddenly went from Hitler's Nazism to Stalin's communism. Harry Truman now had a new war to fight, the Cold War. Should we fail in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. We must take immediate and resolute action. Own freedoms couldn't quiet the American fear of communism. Ho was a communist, and now he was a threat. The way they try to depict Vietnam is that Vietnam is a part of this great big international communist conspiracy. And there was a slogan that was used at the time that was called the domino theory, that if Vietnam falls, all the rest of Southeast Asia falls. And so the whole thing gets built up in this tremendous thing about how Vietnam now becomes crucial to all of American foreign policy. In 1946, America quietly backed a French effort to retake control of the Vietnamese colony. As he struggled to maintain his 10 years grip on leadership, Ho had a choice: lose everything he had gained so far, or continue to fight for the freedom he finally tasted. Ho decided to fight, and so did his people. In December of 1946, the Viet Minh attacked the French at the port of Hai Phong, setting off the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh didn't have the strength, money, or air power of their opponents, but they had resolve, courtesy of alcohol, and that made all the difference. A revolution is fought not by people out of desperation, because if you have no hope, why should you fight? A revolution is fought by people who are hopeful that if they sacrifice, then within 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, or whatever, their children and the children of their children would have a better life. And it is out of this sense of hopefulness that Vietnamese fought. Ho relied on his prized military strategies for combat operations. General Jack coached the Vietnam in camouflage and ambush, using the terrain to tactical advantage and luring the French into treacherous and tangled jungle. They set booby traps, and when the French were down, the Vietnamese stole their weapons. Weapons supplied by the United States, which bankrolled over 80% of France's combat operations. But for Ho Chi Minh, no challenge was too great. He made struggle admirable. His own image and his seemingly monastic lifestyle set an example for his countrymen. Leaders who attempted to be charismatic leaders, whether Jesus Christ or Gandhi or Ho Chi Minh, usually claim that they've given up everything for the nation, family, wealth, even sex. And in the case of Ho Chi Minh, he was said to have given everything for the country. In turn, Ho demanded unflinching loyalty from the Vietnam, who by the thousands willingly made the ultimate sacrifice. Ho Chi Minh had a meeting with a French official by the name of John Santenay. He said to the Santenay, "I will lose 10 men for everyone you lose, but at the end I'll win and you lose." What he was essentially saying is, I'm prepared to take unlimited losses to fight against the intrusion of the French. By 1954, with mounting casualties, French public support for the war melted away. But as the French considered how to get out of the war, the Vietnam figured out how to win it. They made their move at a heavily fortified French military base in a mountainous corridor known Dien Bien Phu. French forces believed the steep and treacherous terrain provided natural barricades against attack. But in March of 1954, Vietnamese forces ascended the hillside with the heavy cannons and artillery in town. They bombarded their opponents day and night in a battle that French later called 57 Days of Hell. I got goosebumps, I got chilling watching this. Whole Vietnam defied all odds, and as they raised their victory flag at Dien Bien Phu, the French swallowed their embarrassing defeat in a war that was all but over. Watching the war after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and the defeat of the French, it's pretty hard to beat home in terms of public opinion. And even anti-communists, had to give him credit because he's got the corner on nationalism. I mean, he's a nationalist hero. But although Ho could claim victory on the battlefield, he still had to face the rest of the world at the bargaining table. In May of 1954, the superpowers assembled for peace talk in Geneva, Switzerland, and Ho's goal was cast aside. After months of tense negotiations, Vietnam was arbitrarily divided along the 17th parallel, splitting it into distinct countries. And this was a source of great bitterness on the part of Ho Chi Minh because he expected, "Hey, I've done all this independence work, I fought the battle, my guys have died, and why can't I have the whole country?" Western powers who had reigns at the peace conference were never going to give communists the whole pie. Instead, they gave him the North Vietnam. South Vietnam was turned over to the government that promised to uphold United States interest. And that tells you something again about what happened to the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh felt so down, double-crossed by everyone. But always pragmatic, Ho strategized that for the moment, even with only half a country, it was better rebuild than go on fighting. And then he never abandoned hope for a united Vietnam. Hope plunged integrating a communist society in the north, designed to lead peasants, workers, and poorer citizens to an equal ranks. For the first time in most of their lives, the Vietnamese would have a stake in their own country wealth. We're dealing here mainly with a 5-year period from 1954 to 1959. He made a very nice, spunky character, baby kissing, going to see orphanage and schools and factories and that sort of thing. But every politician, you have to act in a certain way that you can get the most support from the people. And I'm sure that part of this simple folksy image that Ho Chi Minh projected was calculated. But the other thing was just true. It was himself personally. But no amount of coalition could ensure a perfect road to success. Ho's leadership took a hit when his land reform program spiraled out of control. It was designed to transfer farmland from the wealthy Vietnamese back to the peasants. But it soon turned violent when peasants from Ho's party took revenge against their former landlords. It became a much more radical landform, not only confiscated land of wealthy, many of them were accused like deaths against the people, and some were between perhaps 15 and 45 or 50,000 people executed. Then he would later claim not to have known about the killings. Terror from the land reform campaign would foster deep and lasting resentment against her among many Vietnamese. Oh my God, I don't like this. I think it's important to not to glorify Ho Chi Minh. He gets to be the head of a communist movement. He's not a nice guy. It was very hard for his enemy to try to depict him as some kind of terrible ogre or some sort of terrible dictator. He was always of this wispy, foxy little guy, like to surround him with children and put up all this act. It was this image that resonated. For the majority of non-Vietnamese, he was still the benevolent Uncle Ho, who had given them the first glimpse of freedom. And this is my baby. But the popularity of the whole communist regime made the United States increasingly uneasy. Ho's comrade in the South had formed the Viet Cong, a guerrilla army that used brutality and coercion in an effort to overthrow South Vietnam's government and reunite the country under communist rule. By 1959, in response to Ho's growing influence, then the United States began pouring money, weapons, and support into South Vietnam to bolster the anti-communist. America hoped to keep neutral out of the region. But as its communist forces gained momentum, the U.S. readied itself for war. Convinced they were both stronger and smarter than the French had been, America planned for a quick and decisive victory. Disclaimer, this is just what I'm learning English and doing shadow. There is no political opinion of this. In March of 1965, the first U.S. troops touched down in Da Nang province, South Vietnam, unleashing a military campaign unlike they've done before. We do not seek the destruction of any government. We do not want an expanding struggle with consequences that no one can foresee. This is our policy. We're going to wear them down. We're going to kill so many of their forces that they're going to be worn down and they break them down. It was surrender. We could retreat. But we didn't understand it was unwinnable. Vietnam was unwinnable and it was unwinnable for the French. But it took the US another decade to figure that out. By the summer of 1966, nearly half a million American troops were committed to the region. But once again, he was forced to believe that will was mightier than muscle. People could not figure out, hey, why aren't we winning? I mean, you could take a hill and kill 5,000 infantry. 6 months later, you could fight another back on the same hill. Easy. 3 years in, the war had descended into chaos. The Vietnamese suffered horrific casualties, and an aging Ho grew increasingly frail. The U.S. continued to decimate Vietnamese forces, but as puzzle images of the dead and wounded made their way onto American television screens, it was clear that no one was winning. It seems more than certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. The summers almost a sudden standoff. We either end in real give and take negotiation or terrible escalation. And with each escalation, the world has come close to bring a cosmic disaster. In the end, they broke moral. They were to start until the American public won the Vietnam. By the late 1960s, widespread American protests called an end to the Vietnam War and changed the support for Ho Chi Minh. But the iconic leader was no other hand. On September 5th, just shy of his aide Ho Chi Minh died, exactly 24 years after he had first proclaimed Vietnamese independence. After the war, I asked the general, how long would you have gone on fighting? And he said 10, 20, 50, 100 years regard was until we won. And that's what happened. A tremendous cost. In 1973, the United States began pulling its forces out of Vietnam in what was seen as a gesture of defeat. 2 years later, Ho Chi Minh's lifelong dream came true. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell, and North and South were reunited under communist rule. Four million Vietnamese have been killed or wounded in the effort, 70% of the population. This was the price he paid for the dream of the man whose unshakable determination had brought his country independence. That's finished for today, and luckily that I finished, I decided to do it in the morning since the past 2 days I missed and didn't finish the task for myself.